There was a time when the sky of Israel was a vault of glowing bronze, and Elijah was the force of nature who broke it. Wait to see how the prophet of fire, who outran chariots and summoned lightning, collapsed into the dust of a spiritual short-circuit. Stay to watch the autopsy of a leader who asked for the end, not for lack of faith, but for a lack of breath to exist. Don't miss this survival protocol for when your soul rapture under the weight of being who you are. This is the mirror of your exhaustion. This is the Bible teaches. Elijah's solitude in that wilderness was not the geographical isolation described by maps, but the exile of a mind that had become its own jailer, where every thought of duty fulfilled was crushed by the sensation that nothing was ever enough. The dry wind blowing against his face carried the stench of the charred flesh from previous sacrifices, but now the smell was of ashes and of an end he wished to hasten with all the strength that had not yet abandoned him. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of centuries on his eyelids, allowing the dust in his eyelashes to mix with the tears of a hero who discovered, in the most painful way possible, that his divinity did not exempt him from being terribly human. In that heavy torpor, the prophet who once commanded fire could now barely command his own heartbeat, surrendering to the hard ground like one who gives up on a war that was never his to win alone. The desert is not merely a geographical place of sand and jagged stones, but a state of the soul where all external voices fall silent so that the internal scream may finally be heard in all its biological rawness. Elijah lay on the hard ground, and every breath seemed to drag shards of glass through his lungs, not because of the sand, but because the weight of being the man who never fails had finally crushed his skeletal and emotional frame. He had reached the point where sunlight is perceived as an assault, and the silence of the horizon feels like a death sentence, a stage where depression ceases to be a poetic sadness and becomes the smell of weary flesh and a coldness in the bones that no fire from Carmel could warm. Elijah's desire to give up was not born of a doubt about God's existence, but from an absolute exhaustion of his own humanity, a collapse where purpose was lost amidst the noise of a nervous system screaming for help. There, beneath the twisted root of the broom tree, the prophet experienced what many modern leaders feel when the stage lights go out and nothing remains but the taste of ashes in the mouth and the realization that they are terribly replaceable. He closed his eyes, hoping that oblivion would be his final refuge, wishing the earth would swallow him before Queen Jezebel could, because in the mind of someone who has hit burnout, eternal sleep feels more merciful than the next awakening. The man who once controlled the heavens now had no control over his own eyelids, surrendering to a heavy, sickly torpor, unaware that his recovery protocol would not begin with a sermon or a new miracle, but with the divine recognition that he was, above all else, dust and biology. This biological exhaustion parlaying Elijah is the same that today hijacks the vision of those who believe the value of life is measured only by uninterrupted productivity and the delivery of spectacular results. The prophet of fire was being consumed not by an enemy army, but by the very glory he believed he had to sustain alone, an illusion of omnipotence that transforms faith into a burden of lead. The tremor in his hands, now stained with dust and salt, was the final warning that his body had reached the absolute limit of its nervous endurance, forcing him to face the darkness where God's voice was not yet a whisper, but a terrifying absence. In that moment of falling, Elijah's spirituality was reduced to the basics of survival, proving that the first step to healing is not a new prayer, but the acceptance of one's own fallibility and the desperate need for a rest that the world cannot offer. The silence of the desert was so dense that the prophet could hear the echo of his own pulse, a sound that once felt like the march of a victorious army, but now sounded like the countdown of a life that had hit rock bottom. He felt the sweat dry on his forehead, creating a rough crust that reminded him of every mile run in panic. Physical evidence that his flight was not away from a queen, but into an emotional cave from which he saw no exit. Elijah's depression was not a spiritual choice, but the response of matter that was not designed to carry the weight of heaven without intervals for the rest of the earth. Under the waning shrub, he became a small stain of despair in the vast ochre of the desert, a living reminder that even giants can be brought down by a short-circuited nervous system begging for the right to simply stop existing. The sleep that enveloped the prophet beneath that solitary tree was not the restorative rest of a man at peace, but a heavy, almost cadaverous torpor, the kind belonging to one who has used their last reserve of dopamine just to keep from crumbling before their enemies, leaving behind only an exhausted biological carcass. In that oppressive stillness of the wilderness, where the only sound was the dry whistle of the wind cutting through limestone, the divine presence did not manifest with the roar of an earthquake or the dread of a devouring fire, but through a touch that carried the delicacy of someone handling something extremely brittle. An angel whose garment seemed woven from the very light of dusk leaned over that body, stretched out in the dust, and the contact of his hand on Elijah's shoulder was the first sign that heaven was not interested in demanding results from a broken man, but in restoring the dignity of his material being. That touch did not bring a summons to new battles or a rebuke for his wish to die, for the messenger understood that before any spiritual restoration, it was necessary to treat the multiple organ failure of the senses that burnout had triggered in that weary heart. Upon opening his eyes, Elijah did not find an army of fiery chariots ready for war, but something terribly simple and profoundly therapeutic. The smell of fresh bread baked on hot stones, and the clarity of a jar of water glistening under the pale light. The divine protocol for healing extreme exhaustion began by ignoring theology and focusing on the most basic needs of the flesh, because God knew that Elijah's deep depression had a physical root that needed nourishment before his mind could process any new purpose. That bread was not just food, it was a silent message that holiness does not ignore hunger, and that caring for the body is often the first step toward liberating a mind imprisoned by mental exhaustion. The prophet ate and drank with the slowness of someone relearning how to live, feeling the warmth of the food descending his parched throat and the moisture of the water cleansing the taste of ashes that flight had left in his mouth, allowing his biology to receive permission to simply exist without the pressure of having to achieve something grand. However, the weight of decades of struggle and the deep wound left by Jezebel's threat would not be healed with a single meal. As proof, after eating, Elijah plunged once more into the abyss of sleep, as if his soul was still trying to hide in a place where pain could not find him. God did not prevent him from sleeping a second time, nor did he shake him with urgency, demonstrating a therapeutic patience that the modern world, with its obsession with immediate productivity, could never understand or offer to the fallen. The angel remained there, guarding the sleep of a man who had become a shadow of himself, validating the need for prolonged rest for one who had carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders for far too long. This second phase of Elijah's sleep reveals that the process of recovering from burnout is not a straight line of instant improvement, but a succession of rest cycles where the mind and nervous system need time to recalibrate before attempting to look at the horizon again. When the angel's touch was repeated for the second time, the voice that accompanied the gesture brought a renewed awareness of reality. Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. This phrase was not a demand for performance, but an honest recognition of human fragility in the face of the journey that lay ahead, establishing that the strength to continue would not come from an effort of self-will, but from the nourishment provided by an external source. Elijah realized that his recovery was not an isolated event, so he could go back to being the hero he once was, but a preparation for a life transition where he would learn to walk no longer by the power of his adrenaline, but by the constant sustenance of a grace that respects the limits of weariness. He stood up, his movements now less heavy, and ate again, allowing that supernatural energy infused into natural elements to begin rebuilding the foundations of his emotional resilience, preparing the ground for the encounter that would change his perception of the voice of God. The silence of the desert began to lose its terrifying tone, becoming an incubation space where the man who wanted to die began to feel the first pulse of a will to walk, even though the destination was still an unknown hidden behind the mountains of Horeb. Recovery from burnout, according to the protocol Elijah experienced, teaches that purpose can only be rediscovered when the body is respected and the soul is given permission to be vulnerable before its creator. That bread and water were proof that God does not discard his servants when they reach the limit of their physical endurance. Instead, he sits beside them in the dust to offer what is necessary for the next step, transforming the place of surrender into an altar of silent and profound restoration. Elijah was now ready to walk 40 days and 40 nights, not because his depression had completely vanished, but because he had been sustained by a hand that knows the difference between a rebellious heart and a nervous system that has simply reached its end. The 40-day and 40-night journey that followed was not the triumphal march of a restored hero, but the mechanical and painful displacement of a man who still carried the dead weight of his traumatic memories in every joint of his body. Elijah walked under a sun that felt like a hot metal blade against the back of his neck, traversing expanses of sand and rock where the horizon never changed, creating a visual monotony that mirrored the sterile desert of his own mind. His feet, protected by worn leather sandals hardened by dried sweat, marked the soil of Judah with a rhythmic insistence, but his gaze remained fixed on the ground, fleeing from the vastness that reminded him of his own insignificance before the forces that tried to destroy him. He was not just moving toward a sacred mountain. He was fleeing from civilization, from temples, from altars, and from any human voice that might demand a strength he no longer possessed, seeking in absolute isolation an answer that the noise of Ahab's palace had violently silenced. The dust accumulating on his eyelashes and the salt encrusting his beard were the physical marks of a soul that refused to stop. Not out of courage, but out of an instinctive need to find a place where God's presence was not a theological concept, but a reality capable of sustaining his weight. Upon reaching the steep slopes of Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Elijah did not seek the sunlit summit, but the damp, dark safety of a cave, a womb of stone where he could finally hide from the gaze of the world and his own history of pain. The interior of the cave smelled of cold earth and ancient minerality, an environment where the shadows were dense enough to offer the anonymity that burnout demands of those who can no longer maintain the mask of spiritual perfection. He sat on the stone floor, feeling the roughness of the rock against his back, and there, in a silence that seemed to carry the weight of tons of granite, he waited for something he could not even define. A rupture in the normality of his agony that would justify the fact that he was still breathing. The isolation of the cave was the final stage of his collapse, the moment when human psychology hits rock bottom and must decide if the darkness will be a tomb or a cocoon for a new form of existence. Elijah was surrounded by centuries of geological silence, a broken prophet in a place that once trembled with the glory of God, but now seemed only an indifferent void to his personal suffering. It was in this environment of sensory deprivation and accumulated psychological tension that the divine question finally echoed, not from the outside, but vibrating within the walls of that stone chamber. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" This question was not a request for information, but a spiritual scalpel aimed at exposing the wound the prophet tried to hide beneath layers of self-pity and mental exhaustion. Elijah's answer came as a hoarse lament, a list of grievances he had been cultivating during all those miles of desert, focused on his solitary zeal and the betrayal of an entire nation that had abandoned the covenant with the Creator. He poured out his bitterness like one bleeding and infected wound, claiming to be the only faithful remnant, a perception distorted by burnout that makes the individual feel tragically unique in their pain and isolation. God listened to the outburst without interruption, allowing the emotional poison to be expelled before confronting Elijah's perception with a demonstration of power that would redefine his understanding of the nature of divinity. The command for him to go out and stand before the Lord on the mountain was the signal for a sequence of phenomena that would test what remained of the prophet's resilience. First, a mighty and strong wind passed by, tearing the mountains apart and breaking the rocks with such violence that the sound seemed like the roar of 1,000 armies in collision. But the sacred text is emphatic in saying that the Lord was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake that made the earth beneath Elijah's feet unstable and treacherous, a force that shifted physical reality and reminded the prophet of his own fragility before creation. But the Lord was not in the earthquake either. Finally, a devouring fire licked the slopes of the mountain, illuminating the darkness of the night with an incandescent fury that evoked memories of Carmel. But once again, the Lord was not in the fire. These external manifestations were everything Elijah knew about the power of God, the spectacular, the noisy, and the destructive. But none of them was capable of touching the core of his depression or offering the healing his soul cried out for. Only after the chaos of the wind, the earthquake, and the fire did the most terrifying and healing phenomenon of all emerge: the sound of a thin silence, a gentle breeze that hardly displaced the air, but possessed an authority that thunder could never reach. Upon hearing that whisper, Elijah covered his face with his cloak of animal skin, recognizing that the true presence of God does not dwell in the noise of performance or the spectacularity of miracles, but in the stillness that restores the exhausted nervous system. The thin silence was the divine antidote to Elijah's burnout, a communication that required no shouting, but listening, proving that the God who governs the universe is capable of whispering into the ear of a broken man to remind him that life still has a rhythm that does not depend on his anxiety or weariness. In that breeze, the tension hardening the prophet's neck began to give way, and he understood that his recovery would not come from a new demonstration of public power, but from a silent intimacy that the modern world insists on ignoring. The sound of that thin silence still resonated in Elijah's bones when the divine voice, now stripped of any tone of judgment, repeated the question that had confronted him inside the cave. But this time, the prophet's answer seemed to echo from a soul that no longer tried to fight against its own finiteness. God's whisper on Mount Horeb was not just emotional comfort, but a profound reorientation aimed at healing Elijah's burnout by removing the unbearable weight of spiritual exclusivity. The prophet's exhaustion had been fueled by the distorted belief that the fate of Israel depended solely on his strength, his prayers, and his solitary resistance against the apostasy of an entire nation. However, the definitive healing did not come with the promise that Jezebel would die immediately or that the people would convert en masse, but with the command that he should return by the way of the desert of Damascus to anoint new leaders and, crucially, a successor. This divine decision reveals that recovery from mental collapse involves the recognition that the world will continue to turn, even when our hands stop trying to hold its axis. Elijah emerged from the cave with eyes still half closed from the daylight, but the dust covering his skin now seemed less a mark of defeat and more the texture of someone shaped by the patience of a creator who is in no hurry. The task of anointing Hazael over Syria, Jehu over Israel, and Elisha as his successor was the practical antidote to the feeling of total isolation that had led him to wish for death under the broom tree. God was teaching Elijah the art of delegation, the wisdom to understand that a man's purpose is not to carry the universe on his back, but to fulfill his part in a tapestry that extends far beyond his own biological existence. By pointing to Elisha as the man who would continue his work, the Lord was gently removing from Elijah the crown of thorns of absolute responsibility, allowing him to return to being a servant and no longer an improvised savior of himself. This transition is the most difficult part of burnout recovery, accepting that our usefulness is not measured by our indispensability, but by our ability to prepare the ground for others to walk where we will no longer be able to reach. The walk back north was marked by a new perception of reality, where the silence of the desert was no longer a vacuum of abandonment, but a space for reflection on the 7,000 whom God revealed were still faithful in Israel. Elijah's depression had blinded him to the existence of these remnants, making him believe he was a solitary point of light in an endless darkness, an error of perspective common to all who reach the limit of nervous exhaustion. Knowing that he was not alone and that there was an invisible network of faithfulness sustaining the divine covenant was what finally dissolved the coldness inhabiting his bones, allowing his heart to regain the rhythm of hope. The prophet who once ran to save his life now walked to transmit his legacy, understanding that his strength lay in his connection to the whole and not in his individual performance before the altar. The road to Damascus became the road to his psychological liberation, where every step taken away from Horeb was a step toward a life where zeal would no longer be synonymous with self-destruction. Upon finding Elisha in the field, plowing the earth with 12 yokes of oxen, Elijah did not see just an assistant, but the mirror of his own need for rest and continuity. A man who brought in his youth and vigor, the vitality that burnout had drained from the old prophet. The gesture of casting his animal skin cloak over the young man's shoulders was not just an act of transferring prophetic authority, but the outburst of one handing over a load too heavy to be carried by one person for so long. There was a raw realism in that scene. The smell of damp earth, the sweat of the animals, and the dust of the field mixing with the sacred aura of a destiny being shared. Elisha, by leaving everything to follow the exhausted mentor, became the companion Elijah never knew he needed. The human support God provided, so that the prophet's final years would not be lived in the isolation of depression, but in the fellowship of discipleship. Elijah's healing was completed through relationship, proving that mental and spiritual health flourishes where there is recognition of our mutual dependence and our shared limitation. This biblical protocol against burnout teaches that the urge to give up is often the sign that we are trying to operate under a load that was never ours to carry alone. Elijah was not healed to return to being the pitiless vigilante of Carmel, but to become the master who would prepare the next generation, transforming his pain into wisdom and his exhaustion into a new type of silent authority. He learned that God is as present in the gentle breeze as in the baked bread and the company of a faithful successor, revealing a face of divinity that values the biology of rest as much as the bravery of faith. The man who asked to die under a broom tree ended his journey not in oblivion, but in a chariot of fire, not because he was perfect, but because he allowed God's silence to rebuild the broken pieces of his humanity. Elijah's case remains a beacon for everyone who feels crushed by the demands of their time, reminding us that healing begins with a touch, passes through a meal, and is consolidated when we accept that our greatest victory is knowing when it is time to pass the mantle and trust in the silence that sustains us. The descent from Mount Horeb was not a return to the palace or the arenas of public confrontation, but a plunge into the laborious simplicity of the earth, where the sacred mixes with the common sweat of those who draw sustenance from the soil. Elijah walked now with a different rhythm, less driven by the urgency of fear and more sustained by the certainty that his mission was about to become a seed planted in the life of another. As he approached the lands of Abel-Meholah, the scene that opened before his eyes was the absolute contrast of the silent desert. The sound of yokes of oxen cutting through the damp soil, the cry of the plowman, and the pungent smell of upturned earth rising under the afternoon sun. At the center of that agricultural choreography was Elisha, a man whose physical strength and youth represented everything Burnout had tried to steal from Elijah, but who now served as the ideal vessel for an authority that needed new shoulders to continue its historical trajectory. The sight of Elisha holding the plow with firm, calloused hands was the materialization of God's answer to the exhausted prophet. The work would not die with him, because the Creator always prepares the successor even before the predecessor reaches their absolute limit. Elijah's gesture of throwing his cloak over Elisha was an act of non-verbal communication loaded with symbolism that transcended the transfer of office, being, in truth, the release of a burden that had weighed for decades. That cloak, made of rough animal skin, impregnated with the dust of Carmel, the salt of Beersheba, and the silence of Horebe, carried the story of a man who had come to the end of himself to find the beginning of something greater. When the leather touched the shoulders of the young plowman, there was a rupture in the normality of that field routine, a moment when the fate of a nation was transferred from an exhausted nervous system to a heart ready for sacrifice. Elijah did not say a single word of instruction at that moment. He let the weight and texture of the object speak of the responsibility, the loneliness, and the glory that accompanied the prophetic calling. The realism of the scene was palpable. The heat of the sun reflected in the bronze blades of the plows, Elisha's tremor as he realized the magnitude of what he was receiving, and Elijah's gaze, which no longer sought death, but the rest of one who knows his part, was faithfully fulfilled. Elisha's response, asking to kiss his parents before leaving, brought to the surface the humanity Elijah often felt he had to sacrifice for the sake of his ministry, serving as a reminder that serving God does not require the annihilation of affections, but their reordering. Elijah, in a flash of wisdom that only the desert and the thin silence can provide, gave him permission to go, recognizing that anxious haste is the mother of burnout and that a solid calling endures the time of necessary farewells. The sacrifice Elisha performed afterward, slaughtering his yoke of oxen and burning the wooden equipment to cook the meat for the people, was the seal of a decision with no return, a ritual of fire that mirrored Carmel, but with a purpose of fellowship and not confrontation. The smell of roasted meat in the field and the heat of the flames fueled by the wood of the plows were the sensory elements that marked the beginning of a new phase for both. For Elisha, the start of a journey of service. For Elijah, the beginning of a mentorship that would save him from the isolation depression tried to solidify. From that day on, Elijah no longer walked alone, and this change in his relational structure was the final component of his psychological and spiritual healing after the episode of burnout. Having Elisha by his side, Serving him meant that the prophet now had someone to share the daily burden, someone to hear his stories, to hold the water jar, and to be the witness that his life had borne fruit that would survive his departure. The assistant's presence was a constant antidote to the lie that he was the only faithful one, an illusion that had crushed him under the broom tree, but now vanished before the reality of an ardent disciple. The psychology of healing here is profound. Isolation feeds depression, but mentorship and discipleship generate renewal because they transform the pain of the past into a teaching tool for the future of another. Elijah was being healed not through a new spectacle of fire, but through the investment of his life in the life of another man, allowing his authority to flow like a river rather than a stagnant dam. The years that followed under this new dynamic prepared Elijah for the most extraordinary ending in biblical history, transforming the fugitive of Jezebel into the traveler of fiery chariots. He learned that God's voice is more frequent in the whisper than in the thunder, and that divine sustenance is found in both the miraculous bread and the loyal friendship of a successor. Burnout was not the end of Elijah, but the necessary interruption that taught him to be human before divinity, forcing him to recognize that a man's strength has limits, but that God's grace is an infinite reserve that respects our fragility. The prophet who once wanted to bury himself in the dust ended his journey being taken up to heaven, leaving behind a mantle, but carrying with him the lesson that the greatest victory over exhaustion is total surrender to a God who loves us not for what we do, but for who we are before him. Elijah's story ends like a hymn to biological and spiritual resilience, proving that after the winter of the soul and the desert of exhaustion, there is always a field ready to be plowed and a whisper ready to be heard. The end of Elijah's earthly journey did not occur in a hospital bed or in the isolation of a cave, but in the constant movement of one who learned that life is a flow that does not belong to us, a river that continues to run even when we leave its banks. He and Elisha walked together from Gilgal to Bethel and from Bethel to Jericho, repeating a path that seemed like a final review of the places where Israel's faith had been tested and forged over the centuries. The realism of this last march was felt in the weight of the wool garments, in the heat rising from the packed earth, and in the silence pregnant with meaning that existed between the master and the disciple. Elijah, the man who once collapsed under a bush asking for death, now walked with the serenity of one who no longer flees from anything, for the encounter at Horeb had removed from him the sting of fear and the anxiety of solitary performance. Elisha, on the other hand, kept a watchful eye and a stubborn refusal to move away, a sign that Elijah's healing through the relationship had been so deep that the disciple now felt like an inseparable part of that restored soul. Upon reaching the banks of the Jordan, Elijah took his cloak, the same object that once served as a cover in his depression and as a calling for Elisha, and struck the waters with an authority that no longer needed shouts or dramatic demonstrations of effort. The river opened, revealing the bed of damp stones and ancient mud, allowing them to pass over on dry ground to the other side, a gesture that echoed the crossing of Joshua and Moses, connecting Elijah's individual pain to the grand narrative of a people's redemption. On the other side of the river, in the solitude of the desert that was once his enemy, the prophet offered his successor the final gift. "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." Elisha's request for a double portion of his master's spirit was the final recognition that Elijah's life, despite all its collapses and biological weaknesses, had become a reservoir of spiritual power that burnout could not drain. Elijah responded with the sobriety of one who knows the limits of his own will, establishing that the inheritance of the Spirit was not something he could control, but something Elisha would receive if he kept his gaze fixed on the invisible reality that was about to manifest. The moment of departure was a violent rupture in the physics of the natural world, an event where matter and spirit collided with the blinding glare of chariots and horses of fire that appeared out of nowhere, separating the two men in a whirlwind of energy and heat. There was nothing clean or ethereal about that scene. It was the roar of a wind that tears mountains apart, the heat that burns the eyelashes, and the centrifugal force of a vortex that lifted Elijah to a dimension where weariness and depression have no jurisdiction. The man who asked to be swallowed by the earth was, instead, snatched by heaven, proving that God's plans for those who feel exhausted are always greater than our ability to imagine the end. Elijah disappeared into the immensity of the light, leaving behind nothing more than his mantle falling slowly through the air, a piece of worn leather that now rested in the dust, waiting for the hands of the one who would continue the work. Elisha's cry, my father, the chariot of Israel and its horsemen," echoed through the empty valley, marking the beginning of a new era where Elijah's physical absence would be filled by the multiplied presence of his influence. The solitude that followed for Elisha, standing by the edge of the Jordan with the master's mantle in his hands, was the inverted mirror of Elijah's solitude under the broom tree, but now without the poison of self-pity. Elisha took the mantle and struck the waters, calling upon the God of Elijah, and the river's immediate response proved that a man's healing and purpose survive his departure, becoming sustenance for those who remain. Elijah was not just a prophet who went to heaven. He was the man who taught us all that the urge to give up is only a station, not the final destination, and that the God who sees us at the bottom of the pit is the same who prepares a fiery chariot for us. Elijah's legacy was not the fire of Carmel, but the wisdom that God's whisper is stronger than the chaos of the world, and that our fragility is the place where divine strength chooses to dwell most perfectly. He departed, but left behind the script for a healing that begins with a piece of bread and ends in eternity, revealing a face of the Creator that values every sigh of his weary servants. This conclusion to Elijah's journey serves as definitive proof that burnout is not a spiritual death sentence, but a necessary process of deconstruction so that a new and more resilient identity can be formed. The prophet who saw fire descend from heaven and then wished for life to go out found his redemption in the acceptance of his own humanity, allowing God to be God in his weakness. Looking at the place where the chariots ascended, we see not only a miracle, but the crowning of a restoration process that respected sleep, food, silence, and relationship. Elijah is the mirror of each of us who has felt the weight of the world crush our chest, offering the hope that after the cave and the desert, there is always a Jordan ready to open and a mantle ready to be passed. His story is a living testimony that our greatest exhaustion can be the prelude to our greatest elevation, provided we have the courage to cover our faces before the whisper that calls us out of our personal darkness. The journey we have taken alongside Elijah, from the ashes of his total exhaustion to the whirlwind of his ascension, is not just a record of distant events in time, but a spiritual autopsy of our own contemporary soul. We live in a world that idolizes performance and pushes us toward Carmel every day, demanding that we be unbreakable, that we bring fire from the heavens, and that we never show the tremor in our hands that anxiety causes. However, the God of Elijah teaches us that the cure for our mental fatigue is not in trying to be stronger, but in having the humility to be dust before the one who formed us with love and patience. If today you find yourself under your own broom tree, feeling that purpose has dissolved in the midst of empty productivity noise, remember that the first step of your restoration can be as simple as allowing yourself to sleep, to eat, and to accept that you are not the savior of the world. The divine protocol against burnout begins where our self-sufficiency ends, revealing that God's grace is the only safety net capable of holding us when our nervous system reaches its breaking point. The whisper that Elijah heard in the cave of Horeb still vibrates today for each of us who feels isolated in the lie that we are the only one who failed or the only one who suffers. God does not want you to carry the mantle of absolute responsibility. He wants you to hear the gentle breeze that says, "You are loved before any usefulness," and that your life has a value that does not depend on the results you present. Elijah's definitive healing involved the recognition that he needed an Elisha, that life is made of partnerships and successions, and that our greatest contribution may be what we leave in others and not what we achieve alone. Do not run from your desert, for it is in it that the angel of the Lord is preparing the table for you, offering the necessary sustenance so that your path, however long it may seem, is traveled with the strength that comes from outside of you. Elijah's story ends by reminding us that the end we so fear is, in truth, the beginning of a way of living where silence has more authority than chaos, and where our weakness is the stage for the glory of a God who never gives up on his weary servants. Perhaps your Horeb is closer than you imagine, just waiting for you to silence the voices of Ahab and Jezebel that scream in your mind, so that the sound of the thin silence can finally reorder the pieces of your broken heart. Do not be afraid of the cave, for it can be the womb of your new identity, the place where your urge to give up will be transformed into a new and deep will to simply be. May the story of Elijah be the balm that calms your tremor and the bread that sustains your march, ensuring that you never walk alone, even when the horizon seems empty and dark. The God who sent the fiery chariots is the same who prepared the bread on the coals, proving that he cares as much about your eternity as about your next breath. Rest, eat, and listen. The whisper is calling your name, inviting you to a purpose that does not crush, but liberates and restores. If this journey through Elijah's soul has brought some relief to the weight you have been carrying, I invite you not to keep this healing only for yourself. Share this video with someone you know is struggling with extreme fatigue, someone who needs to hear that it is okay to be tired and that there is a way back from the abyss. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue these autopsies of the soul together, where the Bible ceases to be an ancient book to become the mirror of our own healing. Leave in the comments which part of this protocol most touched your heart today. I read each one as a prayer. Remember, the road may be long, but you are not alone, and the bread is already on the stone. I am the Bible teaches, and we'll meet in the next whisper. Rest, and may the peace that surpasses all understanding guard your heart.